I will say it's good afternoon now. I'm really loud, so tell me if I'm too loud. It is an honor to be here. I love the DAR. I've given lectures to so many of your chapters, and now I'm at the home base. So it's really cool to be here. Thank you for having me. It is always an honor to bring the history of the enslaved folks who are not in the record. The whole purpose of my life, I've given my entire career to this, and there is nothing more important than telling their stories in places like this to bring light to the darkness of this past. So I'm going to be talking today about my book about enslaved chefs. I'm going to be covering a fair amount of topics. I'm going to kind of run right through it. Excuse me. I'm a historian. Why white ladies? I'm sure those of you that are interested in this are understanding the political concerns right now of doing. If I'm a historian, of people that actually do the thing that happens to me. But as a historian, I pace when I walk. But as a historian, I consider myself someone who goes back, finds the evidence, and brings it to light. And that is a very important thing to do. The purpose of my book is multiple-fold. One, it is to give credit to the men, women, and sometimes children who were enslaved working in these very important, old school colonial American kitchens. It's also to bring what Michael Twitty calls culinary justice, right? Your grandma had that cookie recipe and then some other lady at church stole it, and then she's getting all the credit. Just say the grandma made it, just give a little bit of credit, right? So giving, a justice where it deserves. Also, it's to bring attention to the kitchens that still stand throughout the old colonies. Stratford Hall, I'll be talking about that a lot today for obvious reasons, but these kitchens are monuments to not just American food in our nation, but to those who were literally bound to that fire 24 hours a day. And lastly, and I would say most importantly, my work pushes people to tether the romance of food. I know some of you came here because you want to hear about puddings, and I will talk about puddings, but some of y'all came here because you want to understand what these people, what life was like for these folks, right? So tether the romance of that food to the stark realities of enslavement. I start out my talk with a very sobering piece from my book. I will not read any more after this, I promise. I think people who read presentations are boring. So I will bring you all my energy outside of this book, but I do want to introduce you to a few of these enslaved chefs that I found in the archive during my 10 years of research. Maybe like a shell or something. All right. We're good. I'll be all right. If I drop stuff, we're good. All right. Surry County, Virginia, 1860. It was the eve of the Civil War, and Sookie went to bed every night thinking about the labor of her days. Cooking on a Surry County plantation was a stressful task that occupied all 5 of her senses and consumed almost every moment of her life. She provided several meals a day to the white family who enslaved her and to whomever came to visit. Food was more than sustenance. It was the core of Virginia hospitality. Her friends in the field worked from sunup to sundown, while Sookie remained bound to the fire in the big house's kitchen 24 hours a day. She was forced to cook multiple meals that were both scheduled and spontaneous. Up every day before dawn, Sookie baked bread for the mornings, cooked soups for the afternoons, and prepared divine feasts for the evenings. She roasted meats, she made jellies and puddings, and created desserts for every free person who passed through the plantation. Sookie lived in the kitchen, slept upstairs above the hearth during the winters, and often moved outside come summertime. Her children learned to cook and work in the big house and were always under the watchful eye of the white family. Private moments were rare, as was the ability to truly rest. She rose early to bake, cooked all day, and went to bed with the next day's menu both in her mind and on the large hearth and the first floor of her kitchen quarters. Cooking for a Virginia plantation was a challenging task, one that required culinary talents, nuanced social skills, and physical strength. The labor was intense, lifting huge pots of water, standing for hours by the open fire. Her workday bled into the night with no space for rest. Enslaved cook, and undoubtedly worked herself to death. Cooking provided her and her family with a unique status within the bonds of enslavement, but it came at a high price. In 1860, Suki died at the age of 50 from a hemorrhaged womb, likely caused by overexerting herself for the sake of Virginia's famous hospitality. Dramatic way to not be able to move forward the slides. Hold on. Once you do what? So why cooks? People ask me this all the time. I started this work about 15 years ago when I was in graduate school. I wanted to locate the people within food history. I think it's important that we understand food and culinary trends. We all love eating, right? But who cooks the food means almost everything. It's those people that create the food, remember the food, sustain human beings, create community. Some of the things that I wanted to do in this work is really challenge the myths of enslavement. Sorry. What are the myths, excuse me, of these people who work in these kitchens? Also, what is the reality of their lives? What was the reality of their lives? What was it like to have to work in a kitchen like Suki or like James Hemmings at Monticello or Chef Hercules? What was it like for these men and women to have to literally be bound to the fire, working and cooking for those who enslaved them? And lastly, I want to focus on the legacy of this history, the chefs themselves, as well as the food that they helped create. We're going to jump right in, and let's just go ahead and start talking about that myth. I love this image because it is very typical of one of the biggest myths that I run across, and I ran across, and I continue to see talked about at plantation museums. This wonderful 1950s painting is from Berkeley Plantation, and it encompasses all of the glory that people like to think was happening in these kitchens, right? First of all, the period clothes, totally off. The cupboards, don't look too closely. You're gonna get irritated if you know anything about colonial dress, etc. But what you see here is you see this very clean kitchen, right? You see the lady of the house front and center. I mean, she's cooking that food, right? And she has assistants who happen to be enslaved African Americans, but they look like they're having a pretty nice time in that kitchen, right? This is a very sterile version of what those kitchens were like. I think anyone who's done hearth cooking understands how dirty that job is. You do not keep clothes that clean for more than 2 seconds in that space. And surely the social dynamics were not at all as what you're seeing here depicted. So this is really what I push back against and just ask people to think critically about these ideas that we have of these images that very much represent those working in those kitchens. Another myth here, I would say, was probably one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in American history. What you see right here, and I'm sure some of you have this stuff, I've been given so much Black Americana over the last 15 years because this was very much, popular in people's homes all the way up until about the 1960s. So what you see here, excuse me, is depictions of these enslaved chefs being loyal to the white family, right? Even Aunt Jemima over here is making another couple happy on the left. It's very much a part of that sort of trope that you see. You see the cream of wheat man, Rastus, and you also see what I said before is called Black Americana, and that's objects that have caricaturized versions of enslaved cooks and mammies, etc., that you see in the forms of things like cookie jars and spice jars. If you take a moment and look online, we'll find some vastly more offensive images of this, but I use this to sort of talk about the ways in which these images, this idea, right? This idea that enslaved folks were illiterate, they were loyal to the white family, and those working in the house somehow had it better than those in the field is completely wrong. And it was not only birthed out of a pushback from the South and Southern and slaveholding states towards the anti-slavery literature that was coming from the North, they had to create a narrative. No, this is my aunt, this is my uncle, we're like family. While these relationships were sometimes very nuanced, and I have examples where the lady of the house was indeed very close to those folks, there are more cases of these people held in bondage, having to deal with that situation and being subversive in that space. So these kinds of images, they came out of the minstrel shows from the mid-19th century and made their way onto, of course, Aunt Jemima. Now, I know you all probably know in 2020, Aunt Jemima retired. She is now, I found her a couple years ago on all the boxes in Barbados. Barbados is a 96% African descendant country, and her products sell like crazy down there. But if you go now, you will not see Aunt Jemima at your Food Lion or Kroger anymore. So a lot of this as well really reinforced the idea that even after enslavement ended, right, there needs to be these sort of helpers, these Black folks in these kitchen spaces. A lot of times I give this talk and people grew up with a Black woman who cooked all their food, and that's totally normal, right? That's a very normalized thing, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's the job working in the house after enslavement ended was much better than having to be a sharecropper. So there's definitely some history there that needs to be unpacked. But this kind of propaganda really pushes against the ideas that I'm going to bring forth today. So because my background's not just in African American studies, but African diaspora studies, I like to rewind it back a little bit farther than people are used to. People typically start talking about Black history on a slave ship. Fine, that's part of Black history. No one's going to argue that. But I like to go back a little bit, right? Who were these men, women, and children before they were captured and put on those ships? What were those cultures like? What kinds of ingredients and dishes did they cook daily that they then remembered in their minds on those ships and recreated in places like Stratford Hall? I think understanding those roots is essential in understanding those influences that you see in Southern cuisine and in American cuisine. One of the things that was typical in these communities, excuse me, and was typical in all communities, is cooking as community, right? So you'd have these different groups, they would come together, they would have one-pot meals was a big thing. So in these kingdoms and queendoms throughout West and Central Africa, you would have small communities, big communities with massive meals, big old cast iron pots, right? The same ones that you see at places like Stratford, they were also there, and they were cooking things like gumbo and other things that I'll be talking about in a little bit. And these one-pot meals were how everybody came together and talked about family history, folk tales, etc. The same way that our dining room tables now are a sense of community in the family, same thing back then. So you have diverse religions, diverse ethnic groups, diverse diets, all throughout West and Central Africa. And when that transatlantic slave trade hit, all of those very distinct groups, some of whom were at war with one another, were forced then to integrate, right? We think about integration as a Black and white thing. We're talking about distinct ethnic groups, Igbo, Fulani, Congo, these people that spoke different languages, different religions, all ended up in the same exact situation. And it is in that forced integration that certain kinds of recipes, certain kinds of religious beliefs ended up really solidifying because it was the things that they all had in common. A lot of it was lost, a lot of it was saved. The African diaspora, just a quick little definition. It is the forced migration of West and Central African people throughout the Atlantic during the colonial era. It is estimated, a conservative estimate that 12.5 million West African and Central African men, women, and children were transferred from their homes into the colonies. That is a conservative estimate because we don't have all the records. Ships went down, illegal trade was happening, you name it. The Spanish, the Portuguese were in first, out last. That meant that when you think about percentages of where people went, the majority went to Brazil. The second majority went to the Caribbean, which was a mix of all kinds of people. Only 4% of those 12.5 million ended up in British North America. So when you think about the essence of that culture, Brazil, you can go there now and you can see West African food, West African dance. I mean, it is like Africa out of Africa, right? You come to Virginia and you got to look a little tiny bit closer to see what you're looking at. But it is in those moments where you look close, and then once you see it, you can't unsee it. Oh, Stratford Hall, my love. So people would end up, these enslaved folks would end up 3 months on the ocean, Sometimes they would go to the Caribbean if they were part of the British colony, for example, and be seasoned in somewhere like Jamaica or Barbados. That meant that they would be taught to how to be an enslaved person. They would then sometimes be shipped up to places like Virginia. At Stratford Hall, where I'm the VP, and I've been working there for 5 years, the site is absolutely incredible. Home of 2 signers of the Declaration of Independence. Also Arthur Lee, who does not get proper credit, was a spy. So cool. It was also home to, at times, up to 100 enslaved Africans and African Americans. In 1738, when Thomas Lee decided he wanted the house to be built on this beautiful piece of land, there was a ship called the Liverpool Merchant that left Liverpool, went down to Ghana, Senegambia, and then hit St. Helena Island, picked up 82 newly captured enslaved Africans, brought them up to Stratford Hall. Only 70 of them survived the trip. Those 70 West African and Central African people helped build this absolutely stunning Georgian mansion. I think this is one of the best houses in this country. And we give credit to those who lived there. The Lees are central to this. But we also just invite, again, giving credit. Yes, and the West Africans also helped build this by force, right? You can share this kind of history, and it's okay. So you would end up at places like this, where you would either be sent to work in the fields, or you'd be working in and close to the house. Now, what you see here, and those of you that have been to Stratford, that's the kitchen. I'll be talking about that in a little bit. If you ended up in the field quarters, you would be living in a smaller cabin, sort of set up like a village or so. And then you would have a little garden as well, set up sometimes in between or in the middle of the areas where the cabins were. And these kinds of communities, again, I talked about earlier, that diversity of ethnicity and religion. This is where people were like, look, we were warring back in the Congo, back in Benin, but we have to be friends now. We have to figure out how to persevere enslavement. And what do you want more than anything when you're missing home and upset? Something that you eat that makes you feel like you have some sense of humanity and you can remember how it was back in the day, right? So whether it was taking over hot peppers that actually originated in South America, made their way to West Africa, then came back in the slave trade, or whether it was just the practice of cooking certain styles, right? Deep frying meat and animal fat, it was a West African tradition. You can't think about fried fish and fried chicken without thinking about that West African root, right? So these communities would then gather around in what was called the kitchen yards. These are essential social spaces in a field quarter where that community, that culture, those memories were discussed. This is where the folk tales of West African culture were passed down that you still see evidence of today. This is where people would come together and bring a little bit of food together in an area. So each week you would have the overseer come give rations to the enslaved community in the field, right? If you were down in the Georgia Sea Islands, it might be some rice and a little bit of fish. If you're in Virginia, you're gonna get pork because Virginians ate pork and they continue to eat pork, and that's kind of where it is. Maybe a little bit of cornmeal. You cannot sustain a human being on that little bit of food. So what happened is, I'll go back to the last slide. These little, quarter yards were essential in supplementing that diet, right? So enslaved folks were allowed to grow food. This is where they started growing things like okra and hot peppers. Again, anything to remind them of home. And they would also then go hunt after hours to make sure they had enough protein and food to feed their entire family. Now, that one pot meal that was home to them in West and Central Africa actually ended up being pretty important because it was a one pot meal that allowed them to gather all the food together to create one big pot of food, because that's a lot more food than the rations. And it also allowed for this forced sense of community that was essential during this very stressful time in their lives. So kitchen yards, as I said, is also, it's like you see this man over here on the right, from 1861 from Louisiana. This is also where, Black music came from West Africa, polyrhythms of the drums, etc., and ended up birthing ragtime and then blues. These spaces are not just food spaces, they are cultural spaces that are so important to our nation's cultural history. If you ended up working in the big house in the domestic quarters, your life was a little bit different. And this is where my work really steps in. I wanted to challenge the idea that these folks somehow had it better off working in the big house. I work at a plantation museum. People will walk in and be like, oh, the slaves had it pretty good here, didn't they? And it's like, would you have it good if you were 24 hours on watch? You can't even You know, the folks in the field, at least when the sun went down, they had a little bit of privacy. You're in that space in that house, and it is like, go, 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 go. And you were a lot was affected on you as well, having to serve people 24 hours a day. So the two ladies here that you see, this is Hannah Ludwell Lee, the first lady of Stratford Hall. She was the mother of those signers and the spy and a bunch of other amazing Lees. And then this is part of our exhibit where we highlight the leading ladies as well as the enslaved African women. And then to the right, you have a woman named Martha, who's a descendant of the enslaved folks at Stratford. And what we did is we took portraits that we had of the Lee ladies, and we then traced the descendant silhouettes to make sure they had representation in the story. So these kinds of people, whether it was Hannah Ludwell Lee and someone named Suna, or this person here is representing a woman named Abigail, who was a lady's maid, they had very, very close relationships, right? They were doing their hair. The enslaved woman had to sit there and probably hear all about the husband and really be a confidant in many ways of those white ladies. So it's important to understand that those relationships on some plantations were absolutely critical. I would say more so in some ways for the lady of the house, because she had someone to talk to that she could complain about things, right? And then if you were Abigail and having to hear it all, knowing that your children are being raised by your grandmother in the quarter, motherhood gets a little funky there, right? But things like food and feasting, it was conversations between the lady of the house, like Hannah, and the chefs at Stratford. And again, chefs is not a historical term. I call them chefs because it is respect for the food that they were making. I think anyone back then who could cook what they were cooking would be called a chef in 2023. So I just kind of try to give a nod. Totally not accurate in terms of the word, so don't think that I'm saying that they were chefs back then, but I just wanted to clarify that. All right, ladies and gentlemen, what's the deal with the pineapples? We're gonna jump right into Southern hospitality, right? Why is the pineapple hospitable? Excuse me. Any ideas? I mean, they're pretty. Yeah. So exotic, right? Yeah. So if you had connection to the trade that was, going across the Atlantic down into the tropics and coming up, you could get your hands on a pineapple, right? If that pineapple somehow didn't rot from Jamaica all the way up, drunken pirates, carrying them up all the way up the Potomac, if somehow Thomas Lee or Hannah Ludwell Lee got a nice pineapple that didn't rot during that trip, they would then serve it as the most ultimate expression of hospitality. Because that is saying, one, you're connected. Two, that rare fruit, we're gonna eat it together. So Southern hospitality, and there's a reason too where you see pineapples all over Southern plantations. It's synonymous with the welcoming that Southerners are very proud of, right? I grew up in California. My family's actually more from New England. But they don't talk about Northern hospitality. It's just not a thing, right? So thinking about what that term is, Southern hospitality, right? Doors open any time of day. There's roots in that labor that made it capable for people to be able to do that. Now, there's one other vegetable, I will say, that was as fancy as a pineapple. Does anybody know what it is? Oh, you wish. Celery. I know, the collective gasp, right? Celery was also really rare, hard to cultivate apparently, and it was so special that if somebody got their hands on a head of celery, they actually had vases made for celeries to put in the middle of the table. And we have one at Stratford, and it's totally bizarre. But celery was equally as important and as much to show off. And I can imagine though, eat a bite of celery, eat a bite of pineapple. I think one definitely ended up being more attractive. So no one wants to put a celery head on their, on the front of their home either. Important as it is now to all of the sort of social interactions during the colonial antebellum era, just as it is now. There's no difference really, right? The thing is that back then, as you all know, you're all DAR members, and I need to become one because I know I've got family members all in there. But it was really important to show off food and the thought that went into food, because a lot of these very elite families lived very far away from one another, right? The Carters, were the big house, Shirley, was down by Williamsburg, right? For them to be able to visit Stratford, it's going to be a week or so on a bumpy carriage ride to get there. And people would stay for weeks at a time. So food, not only when you first arrived was important, but the ways in which you feasted was important as well. So my work really focuses as well on the larger plantations, not the small ones, Not the, the farmers out in the Piedmont. I'm talking the big, huge plantations. And we've got a lot of those throughout Virginia. Food was also used to show off one's wealth, obviously, right? That's sort of a no-duh moment there. But what I found in the records when I read through, like hundreds of women's letters back and forth to each other, is there was a lot of concern about making sure the food was good if there was a suitor coming to the house. So food then is connected with marrying your daughter off to the rich guy down the road. Really, really important. And then thinking about the pressure of that and the other side of that, right? What would that then do to the folks who actually had to cook all of that food? I'm going to talk about one of the myths really quickly that I love to talk about because I find it particularly silly. And who here has been to a plantation site where you hear that the fireplaces were moved outside because of fire and smell? Everybody? It's a pretty common thing, right? This comes from this wonderful quote from 1705 that says, all their drudgeries of cookery, washing, dairies, etc. are performed in offices detached from their dwelling house, which by this means are kept more cool and sweet. Now, I want you to look at Stratford and I want you to count the chimneys. There's 16 fireplaces in there, right? The fire thing makes no sense because there's fires going constantly. And the smell thing I find hilarious. How often were people bathing, say in 1705? Not often, right? So you're telling me that roasted pheasant somehow smells worse than your husband's feet after they've been out running around on the horse for 5 days? I don't think so. So it's things like this that it was fun. This was not central at all to what I was looking for, but it's these fun, weird little anomalies that you find at these sites. Like one quote turned into this narrative, this massive myth that really has nothing to do with reality, right? I'm sure some of them moved out, et cetera. That makes sense, build them outside. But what architectural historians have found throughout the years is that right when that quote came out, 1705, late 1600s, you have a rise in enslaved Africans and colonial white ladies coming over, tons and droves, and you have a decrease in white indentured servitude in these spaces. So when that kitchen is moved outside, it is a gesture of having to deal with this racial thing, right? Let's move the kitchen outside to have a little bit more space because these homes are becoming these new American landscapes where race was playing a huge part in space, right? The Black codes came out a couple decades before this as well. Strict laws against, defining race as a real thing. And then also establishing certain things that Black folks can and cannot do. So this is a moment in American history where things like that, the physical landscape shifted. Another moment in American history where this happens, also related to food, is the use of dumbwaiters and underground passageways, right? Jefferson, of course, everybody talks about Jefferson. He's a really cool guy. I like to throw the Lees in there a little bit more than most folks. Jefferson goes to Paris and he discovers the dumbwaiter. What does a dumbwaiter do to a dining room table? Dumb waiter. If your waiters are all enslaved waiters, and if you're going to be talking about, I don't know, the Haitian Revolution, if you're going to be later on talking about the Nat Turner revolt, do you want folks who are held in bondage there listening to conversations about liberty? Think of Patrick Henry, right? Give me liberty or give me death. Those conversations cannot be had, could not be had in the presence of literate, sophisticated, enslaved folks who were there serving the meals. So these kinds of objects allowed people to flex depending on who was coming over. So it's really important to think about. My last thing here is this Whistling Walk Underground Passage, this sign. I have to reach out to Berkeley and beg them for it if they'd ever get rid of it, because I love to talk about this thing. It is since gone. Who here has been to Berkeley Plantation? Okay, I was like, please, somebody say that. The talk and the pineapples in the north, and everyone looks at me like I'm crazy, and I'm like, never mind, you don't know what a pineapple is, all good. So Berkeley Plantation is a really important site. It's one of the oldest plantations in Virginia, and their old tours used to pretty much go through the main house. Then we just talk about the men mostly. The women were kind of disregarded, and my goodness, there was no talk of enslavement. They would go outside, they would point to the sign and say, this is the Whistling Walk Underground Passage underneath here, and it goes from the kitchen to the cellar that goes up into the dining room, right? And then people are like, why is it there? We don't understand. And the big joke was, which is ridiculous, is that the the Harrison family and others who lived there would make the enslaved cooks and butlers whistle while they walked to make sure they wouldn't taste the food. It is so ridiculous, right? There's other reasons that might have happened. Maybe they want to hear them come in, just like the dumb waiter did some stuff, right? But that story is completely insane. That sign right there is from the 1940s. Height of Jim Crow, separation of water fountains. Very quickly, a lot of these southern areas where Jim Crow was very much a stronghold went from literally having enslaved nursemaids nurse your child, help midwives deliver your babies, cooking your food, to all of a sudden saying, okay, we have to have this separation of space. So those kinds of narratives are a 20th century weird rewriting of the past. So we have to think about what was rewritten during a period where there was lots of panic around race in this country. Let's talk about the cooks. I love these two images. This is Stratford Hall's kitchen. We have the coolest kitchen, I'm convinced, in Virginia, if not in the country. That hearth is massive. Who here has been to Stratford Hall? Okay, way more hands than Berkeley. I would like to get you all there. I will give you free tickets. Please, please come visit. I will let you touch things as well behind the barriers. This is our original 1738 kitchen hearth. On the top left, we have a man named Wesley Payne. He was the son of an enslaved person who worked there in the later years of Stratford Hall in the 19th century. Wesley Payne is there cooking a massive feast. That is the kitchen that he worked in, until he passed away in the 1940s. And then on the right here is a more contemporary picture of the kitchen. That is Dontavius Williams, our historical foodways interpreter. And he is talking about the life and legacy of Caesar, who I'll be talking about in a little bit. And he was a very important chef at Stratford Hall. So when you think about the work in kitchens, when I first started this work, people were thinking, oh, it must have been so easy, working in the house. You wouldn't have to work in the fields, etc. And I pushed back against that tremendously. I was actually a professional chef for 10 years. So what I did is when I read those old cookbooks that you can find, and if you haven't done this, just take a day, go to an archive, get some of those old cookbooks. You can smell the old paper. You can also see which pages are dirtiest. So you're like, okay, they loved this recipe. There's sauce all over it and it's all ripped up and written on. So I went and I read through all of the menus and letters, etc., as well as the recipes. And I didn't just think about it in terms of that food lens that I talked to you about earlier, right? Okay, we get it. They were eating these things. Fine. What's new about this? What I did is thought about what it would take, put my chef lens on, what it would take to cook all that food on a hearth. Totally different conversation. It's one thing to see a table set and be like, I cannot wait to jump in there and eat. It's another from a chef's perspective to think about how much energy went into cooking every single one of those dishes. The hours were long. I had records of people, if there was a big party coming out, they literally had to sleep in that kitchen 24/7. They couldn't leave pots boiling. Things like head cheese took days to make. You had to have the fire, going nonstop. They also, they also died, enslaved chefs died from burns more than anybody else, because one of the things I've heard from multiple people in oral history from multiple elderly Black folk is that their great-great-great-grandma, right, passed down a story that they used to have to stick their arm in the bread oven. And if it burned a little bit, the biscuits can go inside, right? You make biscuits every day, do the math. So thinking about and also you can see in the runaway slave ads, the scars from getting cut, the burned arms. So really rethinking about what these people actually went through to cook this food is incredibly important. Of course, they had bell systems. I always use the Downton Abbey example. I think you ladies are a little more sophisticated and understand what a bell system is because you're DAR members. But any time of the day, somebody arrives because people are coming from all over the place, right? They roll up on their carriage. It's 3:25 a.m. The bell is rung and food will come because Southerners are hospitable. And that's something that I think, a lot of folks still take pride in, right? Food, feeding people at any other hour days is something that was very much, solidified during this period. Oh, meals. Happy you were like, yes, finally talk about the food already. So I love these images. Most elite Virginians, let's just say, were not eating like this all the time. But my goodness, if somebody important was coming to dinner, or you just wanted to show off that you made a little bit more money than your neighbor, you're going to have the chef cook all of this food. The first course would be everything from fish, saddle of mutton, leg of lamb, right? You have eels over here as well. You have pickled eggs. On the right, the second course, because goodness, I mean, you're going to be hungry after that first course, you're going to bring out the rest of these dishes. And then of course, you're going to have this dessert course, which was made of all kinds of, preserved excuse me, fruits. When sugar became, I have an Audible book on great courses on the history of sugar. And what you see happening to that dessert course when sugar became the main cash crop, right, during the 1700s, is the dessert menus shot through the roof, because all of a sudden you don't have to just use honey and fruit for sweetening things. You can actually start baking all kinds of good stuff, right? So you would have this massive 3-course meal with all kinds of food that was being served. A lot of this, of course, was European influence. Those cookbooks, I'm telling you, go read them. They're phenomenal. So you would have everything from, puddings and pies and you name it, all very traditional European. And typically in Virginia, you would have British sort of influenced food being served in these spaces. And let's talk about the influence, though, of the people that were actually cooking the food, right? This is giving Grandma her credit right here. You cannot think of Southern food, in my opinion, without thinking of things like jambalaya, gumbo, okra, right? Peanut soup used to be a thing. I think some of y'all remember this. I don't know where it went, but these gas stations need to get their life together, because in the 90s, you could drive on any rural road in Virginia, pull over and get the best peanut soup ever. I don't know who decided to stop that trend, but ladies, let's figure out how to bring that back, because peanut soup is also a West African dish, unadulterated, like straight up, like this is the great grandchild of the dishes that they were cooking back in those communities that I talked about in the beginning of my talk. So you have things influencing this table, whether it's okra stew, which there were variants all over Europe. There was also a Senegalese okra stew as well. So the familiarity with some of this stuff was just, it was very similar, yet the spice profile was different. So spices started to change a little bit. You also have things like Mary Randolph in her cookbook. You see okra and tomato stew being written down there. And that is as Virginian in some ways as it gets. It's also as West African as it gets. And again, tomatoes, of course, made their way over and then made their way back over here. So the Columbian trade is something we cannot ignore. But the recipes that were then brought during the transatlantic slave trade era were very much sort of tethered to American food. You have jambalaya, which is the descendant of jollof rice. Who here has had jollof rice? It is, I actually prefer that over jambalaya, but it is like the watered down cousin or something of jollof rice. And of course, as I said, peanut soup, okra, etc. And I argue all the time that I personally think that Southern food is the most Americana food there is, because you have Native American crops. I mean, can you imagine having cornbread, not having cornbread rather with your Southern food or your American food? I can't, right? Even frying catfish, you got to have a cornmeal base. You can't put flour on it. That's gross, right? So you have these dishes that came over in the minds of these folks, written down by the Europeans coming from England, and also ingredients that they would find here in the colony. And then they were all blended together, right? Excuse me. Getting excited, so I start talking really fast. So all of these things literally and figuratively ended up being written into American cuisine. What I found in those cookbooks that I was reading is by the late 1700s, early 1800s, you start seeing handwritten recipes for gumbo, right? All of these dishes are being literally written in these cookbooks written by white ladies, but they are straight up West African recipes. And what I found in my research is that there were moments where somebody smelled something down the field quarter. That cook ended up coming up, cooking something. Maybe one of those 17 million dishes on that table was going to be a little African thing. Everybody was like, okay, make that okra stew again next time. So what happened is that food made its way from West Africa to the colonies and those field quarters, into that kitchen, onto the table, and into our very proud culinary history of this country. The sustenance, I talked about that when I was reading aloud. Oh, thank you so much. This is the cutest little skinny cup ever. Zoomers, this is funny. Okay, I talked about how it was more than just sustenance. We had a barbecue event this weekend that somebody was at Stratford Hall, and I was in the kitchen doing my thing. And somebody came in and was like, tell me the history of barbecue, right? And I talked a little bit about barbacoa and all the stuff, but I was like, you know what? Barbecue in America is a verb as well. It is community. It is getting together. We're having a barbecue. You could have one sad hot dog and a can of beans, but if you're around a grill with your people, your friends and your family, that's a barbecue. And so, thinking about the ways in which food creates objects, moments in time, political movements. And so I show this slide because it's important to understand that food that was being served formally on those dinner tables was very important at getting, Arthur down the road to marry your daughter. But it was also important after hours when the ladies were then sent off to their parlor. They had to go to the drawing room and sew or do whatever. And the men then retired to their libraries, their men's parlors, and started talking politics. Can you imagine a space during the brewing of the revolution where beer wasn't involved, wine wasn't involved, tobacco wasn't involved, rum wasn't involved? All of those things were being made by enslaved, brewers, by, the tobacco was being grown by slavery. Rum is a West African recipe that made its way in the minds of the enslaved folks in Barbados in the 1640s. An overseer went down to the quarter and was like, what are you all doing with the leftover sugar cane? And they're like, we're making it into liquor the way that we make palm wine in West Africa. Bam, right? Rum became rum. So there's all these things that were so important to those conversations that gave people courage to do what they did. So we have to put, in my opinion, the food and the people all together in one conversation. I talked a little bit ago about, those cookbooks. The back of those handwritten cookbooks is all medicine. So I want you to think about the literate enslaved chef in there. Maybe she's having to work for someone that's not too pleasant, right? They got all the recipes for days. In the back of it, they're also in charge. Thomas has a headache, bring some tonic. The difference between one Tylenol and a bottle of Tylenol is life and death. So think about the ways in which just having the access to food, they didn't have needles back then. They couldn't go run up and inject poison into somebody. They didn't really even have pills. You would put things like that in food to eat it. So these chefs, while they had very hard times in those kitchens, and there's instances of rape and all horrible things that I read about in my work, they also had the ability to kind of give a side eye to those folks who enslaved them. And it is because, one, they needed to trust them because the food needed to be a certain caliber. And my God, I say that after Nat Turner's rebellion, I don't think these elite ladies ate for a week. Because the letters that you see after 1831 in Virginia, we're going to give Lucy the week off. Betty can go be with her kids down in the quarter this week. We're not eating. So it's moments like that that really show you that fear was there. Those relationships were nuanced and essential to one another. I'm going to wrap this up here with a couple of things. I do want to talk a little bit about one of the myths that is very pervasive of folks that were working in the house as enslaved domestics, is that they were somehow disconnected from their West African roots. Who here has heard the term Uncle Tom? Everybody's heard that, right? Right? Oh, don't be an Uncle Tom, right? Loyal to the white folks, you don't care about your people, etc. When you actually push the archive, look into the archive, read against the grain in the archive, you start to see how these men and women were subversive in their oppression, right? They actually were doing all kinds of things under the radar of the folks who enslaved them. One of the things that a lot of these chefs were doing is they were conjuring spirits for people on the plantation for protection and putting spells on people as well. So West African religions, as I said before, those groups were incredibly diverse. You had Muslim folks coming over. We had a significant number of people practicing Islam at Stratford, actually. And you also have people practicing traditional West African ancestor worship or conjuring, where they would use this image right here. This is a Congo cosmogram, and it's an X. So remember that 4% I talked about? That 4% of folks? You can see West African religion loudly in the Caribbean, loudly in Brazil. In Virginia, you got to look a little bit closer. Because there were only 4%, they had to come together and say, okay, which symbols, which rituals are we going to repeat? The cosmogram is one that really took hold here. A lot of West and Central Africans during that period and continuing today believe in this symbol to symbolize the relationship between birth and death and the ancestral world and the living. So one part of the axis is birth, the other is death. The top is the physical world and the bottom is the spiritual world. That means when you carve an X in an old piece of pottery that was thrown away. When you get that old spoon that the overseer didn't want anymore and you put an X in it, you're conjuring, by that mark, you're conjuring spirits, your ancestors, your people to come into that space and protect. This right here is one of the examples where I found this happening. It's Flower 200. It's an old 17th century plantation. This particular kitchen was a 19th century plantation. And this kitchen, along with many other kitchens throughout the mid-Atlantic, you find conjuring caches, X's marked on bowls and things, and they are placed in the northwest or northeast quadrant of that cosmogram in the footprint of the home. We found similar things at Stratford, and this is clear examples of those cooks. They're not sitting there being happy to be in that space. They're not sitting there doing whatever their enslaver says. They're like, okay, you're going to give me what I need. I'm going to give you what you need, and I'm going to help my people in the field. And that's a really important thing to understand. This image right here is from, it's called Dance or Ball at White Sulphur Springs, Virginia, 1838. One of the things, a little tidbit, one of the things I found in my research is that these kitchen spaces at these sites were sometimes used for wedding receptions for enslaved folks. Everybody knows about jumping the broom. What I found in the records is that there were multiple times where a couple from the quarter was getting married and they totally shut down operations, and that kitchen was used as an elevated space. Kind of cool. I'm going to introduce you to a couple of cooks before I open it up for questions. The first is Chef Hercules. My dear friend Ramin Ganeshram wrote this book. It's a novel, but it's based on extensive historical research. His story is fascinating, and I highly recommend learning more about him. Very quickly, he was one of the folks that Washington brought from Virginia to Philadelphia when he was the president up there and worked in his presidential home during his tenure at, in Philadelphia. And I consider Chef Hercules the first celebrity chef in this country. Because one, he was a chef, so much of a chef that he sold his leftovers out of the back door for hundreds of dollars a year, a lot of money back then. Secondly, he was recollected by Washington's step-grandson as being sort of, he didn't use these words, the Gordon Ramsay of his day, right? He ran that kitchen. I mean, this guy had it like a tight ship, like he was in the military. The best part about this, and what makes him a celebrity, I would say, is that he also was recollected as walking down Market Street in Philadelphia after his shift. He had silk on, he had velvet pants, he had a big hat, a gold watch, and a cane, and would strut down Market Street, and white men would bow to him. So he went back and forth and there's a whole story behind him escaping, etc., which I won't get into, but it's fascinating because he would have to go back and forth from Philadelphia to Virginia every 5 months and change, because right before Washington got there, he missed the memo, I guess, but Pennsylvania passed a Gradual Emancipation Act. And in that act, it meant that anybody holding slaves, after 6 months of them being on that land, they would have to free them. Washington found out, lost his mind. There's great letters where he's like worried about it. But instead of just being like, okay, maybe I'll hire some folks, he ended up just shipping those folks back and forth to re-enslave them every 5 months and change. The connections that Hercules made, the path back and forth, absolutely, in my opinion, led him to then free himself on Washington's birthday after he was sent back after his tenure in Philadelphia. The last chef I want to talk about, actually two, we have Caesar at Stratford Hall. He was the enslaved chef during Philip Ludwell Lee's tenure there. Incredibly important chef because he is also considered one of the earliest chocolate makers in the colony. We talk about him and his artistry in programs. And then lastly, I want to introduce you to the woman on the left here. She was called the cook. She was documented by David Hunter Strother for Harper's Weekly Bazaar. Excuse me. And he basically was traveling through Virginia. He pulled over in Amherst County and he stopped for a meal and basically just waxed poetic about this woman in his missive, talking about how her children had the first dips in all gravies. She had the wit of gods. I mean, he really found her to be the most striking, powerful woman in that space. And I chose her for the cover of my book because most of the cooks, we don't have their names in the records. She has not a name here. She had a name in real life, but she was not named. And I wanted to give honor, especially to the women who continue to be ignored in culinary history, and especially the Black women, the enslaved women, who had to endure a certain level extra, right, of sexual abuse, etc., in those spaces, who also helped invent American cuisine. And I end my talk with this slide. It's The Liberation of Aunt Jemima by Betty Saar, 1972 in Berkeley, California. And this is a reimagining of Aunt Jemima here. And this was during the 70s, during the Black cultural movement, where a lot of those old offensive caricatures were being sort of redesigned to then put new power and meaning to them. And this was the point behind Betty Saar's work. So I hope that my work is helping to reevaluate, recalibrate the history and legacy of these men, women, and children who worked in these kitchens. And I'm continuing to do this work, and now I'm going to stop talking so you can ask me questions. Thank you. Wonderful question. So for you Zoomers, the question is, how many women were in the kitchen at one time? I will say this about most things, it depends on the plantation, but a place like Stratford Hall, you would have a main cook, a main chef, and possibly anywhere, depending on the event. For an average dinner, there'd probably be 2 or 3 extra people in there working in the scullery, doing the prep, etc. When a big dinner party was happening, it's all hands on deck. You could have up to 20 people, waiters included, in that machine, sort of making all the food. So it just depended on the occasion and the plantation. But there was typically one main chef that called all the shots. Yes. Yes, and at least 1 or 2 people helping. Great question. So I've seen records of the cook's children coming up, picking peas, doing the jobs that you would give to your grandchild at Thanksgiving. So, and learning the trade, and then not always ending up being the chef, ending up doing something else. So as soon as they're able to, 5 years old, you can be doing some of that work in that kitchen. Oh, you're fine. Yeah. Some were illiterate. Most of the ones working in these larger plantations actually were taught how to read. So there is the folks in the field typically know, there were laws that were passed in the late 1700s, and especially after Nat Turner's Rebellion, that really sort of outlawed teaching people how to read. But that was only in that moment. And of course, there might be a sign in here saying no drink or food, and I'm sitting here drinking water. So things happen, for reasons that you can imagine. So there was definitely a high amount, because you can't imagine too, just thinking about this pragmatically, Hannah Ludwell Lee would not be going down to the kitchen every day with her beautiful silk dress telling Caesar the 7 courses to make. She's like, do your thing. So, again, that varied. Yes. Sometimes, yeah, no, sometimes absolutely they would. They would say, I really like these 7 dishes, etc. But, at some point that jambalaya made its way on the table and she didn't ask for it. So it's a conversation that would have been happening a lot. But I don't see that. I don't see someone like Hannah Ludwell Lee in that kitchen, because I've worked in those kitchens when that fire's going. There's other ways of communicating that information down to that space. Yeah. The communication was definitely happening, but I think the big myth that I push back against these larger plantations, you don't have the lady in her big, beautiful dress in there roasting meats. It wasn't happening. I love roasting meat, but did you have questions from Zoom? Sorry. Okay. Yeah.
Pineapple as a hospitality symbol is not actually colonial, but was adopted as colonial revival and attributed to colonial. Any comment?
I've seen it on things that are colonial. So I think that it was revived in a way, and I'm sure it, during that period when they were reconstructing a bunch of stuff, they kind of probably overused it. You definitely see references of those pineapples being pretty important back then, and they're on old homes as well. with the pineapple.
Happy to see him because he may have been gone for a couple of years. And now he brings this exotic fruit there, the ones that are rotten and put right on the fence post when it became a sign of hospitality. So most of the houses that were built on their fence posts and other places around the house, you would have the pineapple motif. Even on the walls. Right, so, yeah.
Was that Cheney McKnight on the second to last slide?
Yes, you go back. These are the three interpreters that we have a lot. Three dear friends of mine. We have Nicole Moore. She's actually at the center, at the Civil Rights Center in Atlanta. She does historical interpretation. That's Dontavius Williams, who I introduced earlier. And that is the one and only Cheney McKnight, who is a YouTube superstar and a dear friend of mine. And they do a lot of programming at Stratford for us.
And you mentioned that the enslaved would hunt for protein-based foods. Were they allowed to have guns, and were the weapons removed when there was fear of rebellion?
Yes and yes. Great question. If you're near the water, they would have been setting up animal traps for any kind of animals that they could get, possums, etc. They'd be setting up oyster traps, not oyster traps, like, crab traps, etc. on the water. And they were allowed to have guns, and more trusted ones would have access to the guns sort of more regularly. But you do have evidence of that. And archaeologically, there's been quarters, like kitchen quarters, that have burned to the ground, and they've found remnants of guns that were in situ on the wall in these kinds of spaces as well.
Is there a good source for more information about the spiritual caches you mentioned?
Absolutely. That is you can send me an email. I can definitely send a bunch of articles on that. If you want to look up most recently, I think it was in the Washington Post a few weeks ago, Harriet Tubman's plantation. They found a cache there. We have significant objects like that at Stratford. More to be discussed later when an article comes out, but yes. Yes.
Between the white family and the enslaved, many times, especially in Virginia, as a white infant was born, a African American infant was given to that infant, so would grow up to be a lady's maid or a valet. And in the case of Thomas Jefferson, he had one called Jupiter. But Jupiter had a lot of freedom. He could travel all over and then come back to Jefferson, and even went to school at William and Mary with him. So they became best friends. But of course, Jupiter did not have self-determination.
Absolutely. And you see this a lot. And actually, I know I bring up Nat Turner a lot. I produced a documentary with National Geographic on him, and I wrote a cover story about him. So I have a lot of intense knowledge of that particular sort of revolt that happened. But when Nat Turner led that rebellion in 1831, he was actually owned by a child. So yes, you have the manservants and the ladies' maids getting given and sort of growing up with those very nuanced relationships. But you also have moments too where someone passes away and you're owned by a 9-year-old, and that's just a little much. It's all a little much, but it's those kinds of ideas of innocence and childhood were not afforded to those who were enslaved.
Evidence from Stratford Hall or other plantations in Virginia of written down recipes to kind of follow up. A lot were in their head, but at some point, were they written down?
I haven't seen any evidence from that period, the colonial era, of enslaved Africans or African Americans writing stuff down, but we do see those recipes written by the white lady of the house, and they do start making their way. So yeah, no, absolutely. And those are the ones, I mean, when you go look at these old cookbooks, it's a lot of those West African recipes have a bunch of, side notes on them. And that means there were conversations happening around so they can remember how to cook it the next time. So absolutely. Thank you.